From the loup-garou of French Canada to the amarok of the high Arctic, Canadian folklore is replete with tales of extraordinary canines said to prowl the forests, tundra, and mountains of the Great White North. In this video, we will revisit some of these old Canadian stories, which have been previously explored on this channel. First, we will delve into the legend of the Dogman and its connections to the werewolf of Quebecois folklore, the legendary dog people of the Fraser Canyon, and the man-wolf, which Dene tradition says roams the frozen forests of the subarctic. Next, we will revisit the maritime Canadian legend of the Black Shuck, or Hellhound, an omen of disaster prevalent in the folklore of Nova Scotia. After that, we will dive into native werewolf legends from western and northern Canada, from the mysterious winter wolf rituals of Vancouver Island to campfire stories of the Rocky Mountains and the Canadian prairies. Finally, we will return to the Nahanni Valley, a storied vale in Canada's Northwest Territories, where a giant white wolf called a Waheela is said to haunt the forests. Enjoy. In December 1991, an American journalist and cartoonist named Linda Godfrey, who wrote for a small newspaper called The Week, received a tip that a strange and frightening animal had been spotted by high school students near the city of Elkhorn, located in the geographic center of Walworth County, Wisconsin. The sighting took place on Bray Road, a rural back road which runs through farmers' fields east of town, and the animal in question bore a striking resemblance to the modern Hollywood depiction of the werewolf. "I'm pretty sure I laughed out loud," wrote Linda Godfrey in a later reminiscence, recalling her initial reaction to the idea that a classic movie monster might be prowling the cornfields and marshy meadows of southeastern Wisconsin. Nevertheless, she called on the teenage daughter of one of her friends in order to determine whether the story might be worth pursuing. To her surprise, she discovered that the werewolf of Walworth County was a hot topic among both teenage and adult residents of Elkhorn, many of whom had seen the same creature on the same rural byway earlier that year. Her curiosity piqued, Godfrey spent the next few weeks interviewing witnesses of what she would later dub the Beast of Bray Road. Those who claimed to have come upon the creature in their vehicles almost invariably described it as an unusually large wolf, coyote, or German shepherd with dark, shaggy fur. Although some witnesses depicted the animal as quadrupedal, many more claimed that it stood on two legs like a human, equaling or exceeding the average man in height. Some portrayed it as having muscular arms and legs, formed like those of a human or ape, and all who saw it claimed that it moved with alarming agility. Nearly every sighting took place at night, and many witnesses said that the creature's eyes reflected the glow of their car's headlights. Disturbingly, the majority of Godfrey's informants recalled the animal acting in a manner suggestive of intelligence, fearlessness, and malicious derision, flashing them a toothy sneer or an unnerving glare as they drove past. The sightings were so eerily consistent, their subjects so evocative of the anthropomorphic wolfmen of Hollywood horror films, that one county animal control officer who had received such reports compiled them in a special manila file folder, which he facetiously labeled Werewolf. Linda Godfrey's first article on the Beast of Bray Road created a sensation in Wisconsin, prompting journalists from across the state to flock to Elkhorn to investigate the story. Encouraged by the resultant positive publicity, new witnesses claiming to have seen anthropomorphic wolves in the surrounding area emerged from the woodwork, many claiming that they had kept their stories secret for years for fear of ridicule. These new accounts engendered fresh hype, sparking a parabolic media frenzy that would grow to such a pitch as to inspire the creation of several books and a 2005 feature-length horror film. Unbeknownst to Godfrey at the time, a remarkably similar surge of public interest in bipedal canine sightings had swept through the easterly state of Michigan just 5 years earlier. This strange spell of enthusiasm began on April 1st, 1987, when a radio DJ named Steve Cook, who ran a radio station out of Traverse City, Michigan, released a song he had produced himself, entitled The Legend. The tune's lyrics were inspired by the all-but-forgotten tradition of the Michigan Dogman, a mysterious bipedal dog said to have haunted the wilderness of the Great Lakes state since at least the late 19th century. Cook, who collected local folklore as a hobby, wove some of the historical Dogman sightings he came across into a poetic chronology, colored liberally with artistic license, and published it on his station as a sort of April Fool's Day prank. To his great surprise, dozens of listeners subsequently called into his station to tell him their own Dogman stories, regaling him with tales they heard from their grandparents, and with a handful of recent personal sightings. At first blush, the Wisconsin man-wolf and the Michigan dogman appear to be the mean of two different types of werewolf folklore to have swept through the Midwestern United States, namely the old French-Canadian legend of the Loup-Garou and the Wolfman of 20th century Hollywood horror films. Were it not for the staggering quantity of reliable eyewitness accounts compiled by Godfrey and other researchers, skeptics could be forgiven for dismissing sightings of anthropoid wolves in Wisconsin and Michigan as misidentifications of more prosaic animals like farm dogs, coyotes, or even bears, amplified to mythic proportions and conferred extraordinary abilities by fearful imaginations pregnant with this horrifying hybrid of traditional folklore and modern myth. The legend of the Loup-Garou, one of the two varieties of folklore of which the Midwestern man-wolf could be perceived to be the product, is the French version of the ancient European tradition of the werewolf. Anglican clergyman Montague Summers summarized this broader European werewolf tradition in his seminal 1933 treatise, The Werewolf, Lycanthropy, writing, "We may say that a werewolf is a human being, man, woman, or child, more often the first, who either voluntarily or involuntarily changes or is metamorphosed into the apparent shape of a wolf, and who is then possessed of all the characteristics, the foul appetites, ferocity, cunning, the brute strength, and swiftness of that animal. In by far the greater majority of instances, the werewolf, to himself as well as those who behold him, seems completely to have assumed the furry lupine form. This shape-shifting is for the most part temporary, of longer or shorter duration, but is sometimes supposed to be permanent." The Loup-Garou of France follows this same general European pattern. Among the most famous French Loup-Garou stories is the poem Bisclaveret, written by the medieval French expatriate Marie de France around 1200 AD. In this tale, the titular protagonist, a virtuous Breton baron named Bisclaveret, reveals to his wife that, for reasons undisclosed, he is fated to assume the form of a wolf 3 out of every 7 days of the week, and can only reassume his human form by donning his human clothes in private. Disgusted and horrified, Bisclaveret's wife convinces her illicit lover, a knight, to steal the baron's clothes after one of his weekly transformations, thus preventing him from resuming human form. Although Bisclaveret retains his gentle demeanor and his lupine body, Marie de France makes it clear that this noble werewolf is an anomaly. Quite a few men become werewolves, interpreted Judy P. Schoaf in her 1996 translation of Bisclaveret, and set up housekeeping in the woods. A werewolf is a savage beast, while the fury's on it at least. Eats men, wreaks evil, does no good, living and roaming in the deep wood. Independent French fur traders called coureurs des bois, or runners of the woods, imported the legend of the Loup-Garou to New France in the early 1600s, carrying it with them on their journeys into Indian territory, some of which took them deep into the wilderness of the Pays d'Au, or Upper Country, in what is now Wisconsin and Michigan. Over time, the New World version of this Old World tradition evolved to become what some anthropologists have interpreted as a cautionary tale, which served to deter young adventurers from adopting the wild lifestyle of the Canadian natives. Most classic literary renditions of the French-Canadian Loup-Garou legend, which were written by French-Canadian nationalists in the latter half of the 19th century in an attempt to preserve them from oblivion, held that baptized Christians were liable to shapeshift into werewolves after going 7 years without receiving the Catholic sacraments of reconciliation or the Holy Eucharist. Like the werewolves of France and other European traditions, the Loup-Garou of French Canada were typically portrayed as men who temporarily but completely transformed into wolves, which were distinguishable from regular members of the lupine species only by their human demeanors, their peculiar flashing eyes, and sometimes their unusually large sizes. As Quebecois writer Pamphile Lemay characterized the transformed werewolf in his 1896 story, Le Loup-Garou, "It's horrible. It looks like any other wolf, but it's not the same. Its eyes are like burning coals. Its coat is stiff. Its ears stand up like horns. Its tail is long. Another portrait of the werewolf, which the Wisconsin man-wolf and the Michigan dogman strongly evoke, is the Wolfman, one of the 4 classic movie monsters of the 20th century. The other 3 arguably being Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the undead Egyptian mummy. Hollywood's stereotypical Wolfman made its silver screen debut in the 1935 horror film Werewolf of London. In that piece, the anti-hero, a pioneering English botanist named Wilfred Glendon, is bitten by a werewolf while on a field expedition in Tibet, searching for a rare flower which blossoms only by moonlight. Glendon contracts the werewolf's mysterious malady through the bite and transforms into a werewolf himself on the next full moon. Instead of assuming the form of a proper wolf, like the loup-garou of French-Canadian folklore, Glendon metamorphosed into a hairy humanoid with fangs, pointed ears, and a pronounced widow's peak. Despite these wolfish alterations to his countenance, Glendon remains distinctly anthropic, retaining a human nose instead of a canine muzzle. The metamorphosed Wilfred Glendon was the first werewolf to appear on the big screen, and served as the model on which many subsequent Hollywood wolfmen were based. As Dutch anthropologist Willem de Blaecourt put it in his 2013 critique of academic werewolf commentaries, since werewolf makeup had yet to be invented from scratch, it provided viewers with the first available impression of how the beast looked. A hairy, distorted, human-like creature, walking on 2 legs, clothed, but uttering incomprehensible sounds. Beginning with the 1973 film The Boy Who Cried Werewolf, which was one of the first werewolf movies to equip its monster with a bestial muzzle, Hollywood wolfmen gradually began to transform from men with wolfish features to wolves with humanoid bodies. This metamorphosis was completed 8 years later, when bipedal wolves starred as the antagonists in the 1981 horror film The Howling. As the World of Monsters YouTube channel put it in their 2020 chronology of werewolf movies, the werewolves here are gorgeous. Upright, standing monstrosities, complete with digitigrade legs. The human hybrid beast is finally here, with long fur, ears, claws, and canines, humanity temporarily absent. The image of the werewolf as a man-like wolf, bridging the gap between the traditional loup-garou and the classic Hollywood wolfman, featured in at least 16 horror movies throughout the decade preceding Linda Godfrey's first article on the Beast of Bray Road, and in at least 6 prior to the release of Steve Cook's tune The Legend. It is certainly possible that this creature of popular culture may have played a role in convincing alleged wolfman and dogman witnesses that the nocturnal animals they encountered throughout the American Midwest were more extraordinary than they actually were. This easy explanation, however, cannot account for another obscure tradition endemic to North America, which far precedes the wolfman's first appearance on the silver screen. Long before Coureur des Bois brought the legend of the loup-garou to the woods of the Great Lakes, First Nations across North America told stories about mysterious creatures with the bodies of men and the heads of wolves or dogs. Unlike the werewolf of European tradition, these entities were not considered to be what some native traditions call skinwalkers, or humans with the ability to willingly or unwittingly transform into animals. Instead, these creatures were considered to be distinct beings separate from man, often endowed with preternatural power. Some Euro-American storytellers appear to have adopted this element of North American folklore and incorporated it into their own werewolf tales. One of these was Honoré Bougre, one of the aforementioned 19th century French-Canadian nationalists, to immortalize the Canadian interpretation of the loup-garou in literature. In his 1892 short story, The Loup-garous, which is based on old French-Canadian werewolf stories he heard around the campfires of his youth, Bougre included the fictional account of a French-Canadian trapper who stumbled upon a band of loup-garous during one of his backcountry adventures. In 1705, the trapper told his audience, the latter being a motley assortment of soldiers, habitants, and Indian warriors assembled at Fort Richelieu to celebrate Christmas Eve. He accompanied a band of Coureurs des Bois on a canoe voyage from Lachine, on the island of Montreal, to Illinois country by way of the Ottawa River and the upper Great Lakes. On the 4th day of their journey, the party made camp at the head of a portage trail which circumvented La Grande Chaudière, a waterfall on the Ottawa River, and resolved to spend several days hunting in the area so as to refresh their larder. The trapper and one of his companions, muskets in hand, headed up a deer trail into the forest and succeeded in bringing down a fat deer. By the time they finished dressing and packing the meat, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Darkness overtook us on the way, Loup-Garou wrote, and as we were heavily burdened, we had stopped to rest and to smoke a pipe in a clump of maple trees on the edge of the river. All at once, and without warning of any kind, we saw a bright fire of balsam boughs burning on a small island in the middle of the river. 10 or 12 renegades, half human and half beasts, with heads and tails like wolves, arms, legs, and bodies like men, and eyes glaring like burning coals, were dancing around the fire, and barking a sort of outlandish chant that was now and then changed to peals of infernal laughter. We could also vaguely perceive, lying on the ground, the body of a human being that 2 of the imps were engaged in cutting up, probably getting it ready for the horrible meal that the miscreants would make when the dance would be over. Although we were sitting in the shadow of the trees, partly concealed by the underbrush, we were at once discovered by the dancers, who beckoned to us to go and join them in their disgusting feast. That is the way they entrap unwary hunters for their bloody sacrifices. Our first impulse was to fly towards the woods, but we soon realized that we had to deal with Loup-Garou, and as we had both been to confession and had taken Holy Communion before embarking at Lachine, we knew we had nothing to fear from them. White loup-garous are bad enough at any time, and you all know that only those who have remained 7 years without performing their Easter duties are liable to be changed into wolves, condemned to prowl at night until they are delivered by some Christian, drawing blood from them by inflicting a wound on their forehead in the form of a cross. But we had to deal with Indian renegades, who had accepted the sacraments only in mockery, and who had never since performed any of the duties commanded by the Church. They are the worst loup-garous that one can meet, because they are constantly intent on capturing some misguided Christian, to drink his blood and eat his flesh in their horrible fricots. Determined to put an end to the ghoulish carousal, the trapper and his companion cut crosses on their musket balls and rammed them into their guns, along with 20 beads from a rosary, which a priest had blessed. That accomplished, they fired into the crowd of wolfish revelers, sending them howling into the woods. The companions then proceeded to their main camp at the foot of the portage trail and told their friends about their frightening experience. They learned that one of their number, a particularly impious soul who bragged of his misdeeds, had failed to return from his own hunting trip. My opinion was then, and has never changed to this day, the trapper concluded, that the man who strayed from our camp and never returned was captured by the Loup-Garou and was being eaten up by them when we disturbed their horrible feast. American folklorist Marie Caroline Watson Hamlin also depicted the loup-garou as a man-like wolf in her 1883 book, Legends of Les Ditois, a collection of what she described as weird tales, quaint customs, and beautiful traditions, which she heard from loving though aged lips of ancestors whose memories extend back into the 18th century. One of the stories in her book, entitled Les Loups-Garous, tells of a young farmer named Pierre Lafontaine, who lived near what is now the city of Detroit, Michigan, in the year 1770. Pierre was engaged to marry Arcage Simonet, the lovely daughter of a trapper who lived in her father's cabin on Grosse Pointe, a district which hugs the western shore of Lake St. Clair. One evening, Hamlin wrote, as Pierre placed Archange on the beach near her home and she lingered, following him with her loving eyes as he swiftly rowed away until he had disappeared, and only the faint echo of his Canadian boat song floated towards her. She was startled by a rustling sound nearby. Looking up, a wild shriek escaped her, for a monster with a wolf's head and an enormous tail, walking erect as a human being, crossed her path. Quickly, the cabin door was thrown open by Simonet, who had been roused by his daughter's scream. Arcage flew into her father's arms and pointed to the spot where she had seen the monster, but the animal, surprised by the light, had fled into the woods. Simonet's face grew pale as Archange described, as accurately as her fears had allowed her to see, the apparition, and he recognized the dreaded Loup-Garou. Some time later, on the day of her wedding, Archange ran into the werewolf a second time while in the woods picking flowers for her bouquet. This time, the creature was dressed in a coat and hat, which he had doubtless robbed from some hapless habitant, and twirled a cane in his hand, striking a fair caricature of a Parisian dandy. Archange fled from the monster, which followed close behind her and managed to slam her cabin door on it just in time. Later that day, long after the werewolf had loped back into the woods, Archange and Pierre were married in a nearby log church. Following the ceremony, locals from the surrounding countryside congregated on the front lawn of Simone's cabin and commenced matrimonial festivities. Whilst the merrymaking was at its height, Hamlin wrote, the dreaded Garou, with a rush like the wind, sprang into their midst, seized Archange, and escaped with her into the forest. All were paralyzed by the sudden daring deed, but Pierre, recovering, started in quick pursuit, guided by the despairing cry of Archange, followed by all the men, whilst the women and children said their prayers and gave vent to loud lamentations. Throughout the day, members of the rescue party returned one by one to Simone's cabin, exhausted, their hunt fruitless. When Pierre failed to return by evening, a handful of neighbors set out to look for him. They found him wandering aimlessly in a swamp, clutching a tattered shred of a wedding gown in his hand. The passage which follows incidentally evokes several strange elements of Anglo-Celtic fairy folklore, which, though interesting, this author will not endeavor to analyze here. When his rescuers inquired as to how he came across the fragment of wedding dress, Pierre returned a maniacal stare, and with a blood-curdling shriek, would have jumped into the swamp if he had not been held back by his companions, who, with sorrowful accents, said, La folie du bois. A footnote explains that La folie du bois, the folly of the woods, alludes to the well-known insane tendency which prompts those lost in the woods to go round in a continuous circle, instead of following a direct path which would lead to a clearing. The narrative continues. He would always return to the same swamp, remaining there for hours, gazing vacantly in the weird reflections of its slimy, stagnant waters, until some friends led him home. Roughly a year later, on the day of Pierre's sister's wedding, the bereaved farmer suddenly sprang into the woods, as if compelled by some sudden impulse. Later that evening, a loup-garou burst from the woods, with Pierre hot on his tail. The wild-eyed farmer chased the werewolf to the edge of Lake St. Clair. The animal, Hamlin wrote, seeing no escape, stood on one of the boulders strewn along the shore, and stretched out his arms as if beckoning to some mysterious one. A large catfish was seen to rise on the surface of the water, and opening its mouth, the loup-garou vanished. And to this day, no Canadian will eat catfish. The footprint of the wolf is still shown at Grosse Pointe, indelibly impressed on one of the boulders. As mentioned, the concept of a canine humanoid prowling the wilderness of North America predates the importation of the werewolf legend to Canada, appearing throughout disparate indigenous folkloric traditions across the Great White North. In the traditional stories of both the interior and coast Salish peoples of southwestern and south-central British Columbia, allusions are sometimes made to a race of dogmen who roamed the land in mythical prehistory. It may be disingenuous to propose a connection between these mythical people and allegedly extant dogmen, as the former must be considered in the context of an old Salish tradition, which holds that, in the ancient past, all animals were essentially human beings, which could assume or cast off their bestial forms by donning or shedding a cloak-like skin. The dogmen casually mentioned from time to time in traditional Salish stories, like fishmen and deermen, are probably not supposed to be perceived as monsters, but rather regular dogs, endowed with the long-lost shape-shifting ability once common to all animals. Nevertheless, there is at least one interior Salish story involving canine humanoids which are clearly distinct from the dogmen of the ancient past. In his 1912 treatise on the Thompson Indians of south-central British Columbia, Scots-Canadian anthropologist James Tate included the following story, set on an old Thompson village called Spuzzum, which lies at the lower end of the Fraser Canyon. The dog people lived in an underground lodge near Spuzzum. Their house was called Kasheksh, or dog house, and had a false door. Strangers, upon entering, and when about to leave the bottom of the ladder to step on the floor, tumbled down into a pit of great depth, where they were killed and eaten by the dog people, who never came forward except at night. Far to the north of Thompson Country, in the stunted forests of the Canadian subarctic, the Dene Indians told their own man-wolf stories. In his 1959 ethnological treatise on the Upper Tanana Indians of southwestern Yukon and southeastern Alaska, American anthropologist Robert A. McKinnon wrote about a goblin or ogre. which the Upper Tanana called Taatsin. According to one version, McKinnon wrote, it has long claws and lurks along the trails in wait for some traveler. It is so feared that even the mention of its name produces a shudder. According to one shaman, the Taatsin appears and disappears in a flood of light, but it is considered bad luck to see it. As in the case of the Brush Indian and other supernatural beings, shamans converse with the Taatsin in their dreams, but they are very reluctant to do so. The Taatsin belief may correspond to the goblin of the Tena, a monster in human form, but with hairy skin and claw-like nails. Or again, the Upper Tanana goblin may be a reflection of the semi-human monsters feared by so many of the boreal tribes. The goblin of the Tena to which McKinnon referred is a creature described in detail by Father Julius Jeté, a French-Canadian Jesuit missionary who lived among the natives of Alaska and the Yukon throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The word Tena is a variation of the term Dene, or Athapascan, a blanket term for nearly all First Nations endemic to the Canadian and Alaskan subarctic. In his 1911 book, On the Superstitions of the Tena Indians, Jeté classified the various preternatural entities which comprise the Dene pantheon. The lowest class of preternatural beings are the Necudzotara, a word which Jeté claimed designated three distinct beings. The first type of Necudzotara are lesser demons, which serve more powerful Dene deities, like a dreaded evil spirit, whose name translates to the thing that kills men. The second type of creature denoted by the name Necudzotara are real existing animals, which are considered as endowed with mysterious qualities, and treated with peculiar circumspection. The third variety of Necudzotara is comprised of what Jeté described as numerous goblins or fantastical beings, with which the fearsome imagination of the Tena has peopled the vast solitudes of his native land. One of the goblins belonging to the third category of Necudzotara is the Yesu, or ghastly wolf, a hairy creature with human form. This monster was said to have freakishly long arms, its fingers tipped with long claw-like nails. Although the appearance of the Yesu forebodes no good to a grown-up person, sleeping children whom the creature pats on the head or caresses will grow up to become medicine men. One specific subarctic legend featuring a preternatural dogman is set in the wild country between the two Great Lakes of Canada's Northwest Territories, namely Great Slave Lake and the more northerly Great Bear Lake. This region, carpeted with boreal forest and frozen muskeg, is the historic homeland of the Tlitcho or Dog-Rib Nation, a Dene people who shared a border with the northeasterly Yellowknife Indians. The legend in question, which most Dog-Ribs know by heart, appears in an article written by a former Hudson's Bay Company inspector named Philip H. Godsell, which was published in the March 1946 issue of the Alberta Folklore Quarterly. According to their traditions, Godsell wrote, the Dog-Ribs originated from the union of a supernatural dogman and an Athabascan squaw. At the time of the discovery of a mountain of copper near Great Bear Lake by a Yellowknife woman, another squaw of the same tribe was living with her two brothers near the site of the present-day mining settlement of Yellowknife, on Great Slave Lake. One day, a strong and handsome stranger arrived, and at the brother's suggestion, took her for his wife. In the middle of the wedding night, she awakened to find her husband gone, but heard an animal crunching bones around the fireplace. The same thing happened the following night. This time, the bride and her brothers immediately lighted torches, but failed to find a sign of any animal. On the third night, one of the brothers threw a stone axe in the direction from which the sound of the gnawing arose. A cry of agony followed, and when they lit a torch, a black dog was found writhing in its death agony upon the floor. When the human husband failed to reappear, the brothers, overcome with superstitious awe, chased their sister out of the wigwam on the assumption that she had married a dogman and a sorcerer. Wandering off into the barren lands, the squaw gave birth to a litter of puppies, which she hid in a bag of unborn caribou skin. When the puppies were able to run around, she was astonished one morning, on returning from her rabbit snares, to find an infant's footprints in the ashes. Hiding herself the next day, she saw the puppies leap from the bag to become transformed into handsome children the moment they reached the light. With a swift movement, she pulled the string of the bag, though not before 3 of them succeeded in jumping back into it. She managed, however, to keep 2 girls and 2 boys forcibly in the daylight, and those children became the ancestors of the present-day Dog-Rib tribe. In this account, the dog ribs look with horror upon any Indian who eats a dog, calling him a cannibal. Northern tales of mysterious dogmen do not end at the Arctic Circle. In his 1875 book, Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo, Danish geologist Dr. Heinrich Rink wrote about a strange creature of Inuit legend, whose upper limbs were those of human beings, but below the waist were shaped like dogs. These creatures were armed with bows and arrows, and dreadful to behold, and could catch the scent of man and beast against the wind like animals. In his 1921 book, Eskimo Folktales, Greenlandic Danish anthropologist Knud Rasmussen identified these creatures as inland dwellers, which inhabited the mountainous interior of the islands of the Arctic archipelago, which he described as human beings from the waist up, and dogs from the waist down. Is it possible that these monsters of Inuit, First Nations, French Canadian, and Midwest American legend are little more than figments of fertile imaginations, or misidentifications of less extraordinary animals owing to the power of suggestion? Could the dogmen spotted historically throughout North America, and from time to time in the American Midwest today, be members of some especially wily animal species yet to be discovered by science? From the moors of Devon to the fens of Lincolnshire, rural areas across Old England, according to regional folklore, are said to be haunted by a mysterious, preternatural canine, most often described as an immense black dog with glowing red eyes. Variously referred to as the Barghest, Hairy Jack, or the Black Shuck, depending on the county in which it is seen, this furry phantom is almost universally regarded as a sinister entity, considered to be a hellhound or servant of the devil, some sort of malevolent, shape-shifting fairy, or an omen of death. The beast is most often seen prowling medieval ruins, ancient burial grounds, lonely highways, and places of execution. One famous historical sighting of this Stygian spectre took place on Sunday, August 4th, 1577, in the quaint market town of Bungay, Suffolk, near the eastern end of the Anglian Peninsula. According to English clergyman Abraham Fleming, who recorded the incident in his 1577 book, A Strange and Terrible Wonder, the apparition materialized at the height of an unusually violent lightning storm, somewhere between 9 and 10 a.m., when the pious residents of Bungay were gathered at the local St. Mary Church for divine service and common prayer. In the middle of the service, while the church shook from the force of the tempest, a flash of fire erupted in the middle of the nave, out of which sprang a ferocious black dog. Many members of the congregation were convinced that Judgment Day had arrived. This black dog, Fleming wrote, if we convert his prose to modern English, or the devil in such a likeness, running all along down the body of the church with great swiftness and incredible haste, among the people, in a visible form and shape, passed between two persons as they were kneeling upon their knees, and occupied in prayer as it seemed, wrung the necks of both of them at one instant clean backward, insomuch that even at a moment where they kneeled, they strangely died. There was at the same time another wonder wrought, for the same black dog, still continuing and remaining in one and the self-same shape, passing by another man of the congregation in the church, gave him such a gripe on the back that therewithal he was presently drawn together and shrunk up, as it were a piece of leather scorched in a hot fire, or as the mouth of a purse or bag drawn together by a string. The man, albeit he was in so strange a taking, died not, but as it is thought is yet alive. Fleming went on to explain how the black dog, after leaving claw marks gouged into the very stone of the church as evidence of its rampage, later made an appearance at Holy Trinity Church in the village of Blytheborough, about 13 miles away. The creature materialized atop the church's rood beam, an ornately carved horizontal timber separating the altar from the nave, which, despite the crown-sanctioned iconoclasm of 1547, still supported a large crucifix. It bounded down into the nave and killed 2 men and a boy. It also burned the hand of another parishioner and knocked down many more. This mischief thus wrought, Fleming concluded, he flew with wonderful force to no little fear of the assembly, out of the church in a hideous and hellish likeness. Stories of mysterious black dogs with paranormal qualities are not exclusive to the British Isles, but also appear in Canadian folklore, particularly in the traditions of the Anglo-Celtic inhabitants of the Maritime provinces. Unlike the infernal, red-eyed canines of English folklore, which have a strong association with the diabolical, the black dogs of Atlantic Canadian folklore are usually perceived as manifestations of human ghosts. Folklorist Helen Creighton included several old black dog stories in her 1957 book, Blue-Nosed Ghosts, all of them set in the province of Nova Scotia. The first story is the account of two boys from the community of Seabright, located on St. Margaret's Bay north of Peggy's Cove, at the western end of the Quebecois Peninsula, opposite Halifax. One still night, at around midnight, the boys were walking down a railroad east of town when they encountered a large black dog they had never seen before, standing in the middle of the tracks. Nearby was a culvert that passed beneath the tracks, where a man had shot himself to death some years before. Idly wondering who the animal belonged to, the boys brushed past it. As they did so, they both felt a sudden, unaccountable rush of wind. Creighton implied that the boys ever after believed the black dog was the spirit of the suicide. Creighton heard her next black dog story from a man named Reuben Smith, who lived in the community of Blanche near the southern tip of Nova Scotia. Blanche is connected with the northerly settlement of Port Clyde by a 15-kilometer or 9-mile road. Roughly halfway between the two settlements is a community called Cape Negro, renamed Eel Point in February 2023, and at the edge of this community was a little bridge over which the old road passed. This bridge was said to be guarded by a black ghost dog, which menaced travelers who attempted to cross the bridge at night. Smith's grandfather, Ross, believed he had encountered the ghost dog years earlier, while walking from Blanche to Port Clyde dressed in his best suit, the one he had worn on his wedding day. After passing an old house near the bridge, the black dog appeared, standing defiantly in the middle of the road. When Ross attempted to edge by, the dog attacked him and tore his clothes to ribbons. He saw the same animal a second time, while driving his horse and wagon one dark and dismal day, past the forested area which Smith referred to as Eli's Woods. It didn't stop him, he said, but it bothered him, and he never knew what to make of it either. Other ghostly black dogs were said to haunt the community of Scottsburn at the northern end of Nova Scotia. Pars Hill, in the community of Victoria Beach on the Bay of Fundy, not far from the historic settlement of Annapolis Royal. In the Birch Cove district of Bedford, just northwest of Halifax, and in a house in the village of Elgin, New Brunswick, located at a historic crossroads. One of the last and most sensational black dog stories in Blue-Nosed Ghosts is the tale of John Obe Smith, an elderly man from Glenhaven, just north of Seabright. "I seen something over here one night coming home," Smith told Creighton. "I seen a big black dog coming towards me, and his eyes as big as 2 fists. I went to fire at him, and the rock went right through him. I threw another one then, and it disappeared altogether. By this time, I was pretty scared, and I was only young. Anyhow, I took to me heels and ran. There was supposed to be somebody killed by an Indian years before, and this was its ghost. Lots of people saw it about 75 or 80 years ago." Although most black dog stories from Nova Scotia portray their shaggy subjects as the manifestations of human spirits, there are at least 2 such tales from that province which have the same diabolical overtones as their older English cousins. One of these tales appears in folklorist Mary Fraser's 1932 book, Folklore of Nova Scotia. "The old people," Fraser began, "believed that the devil often assumed a bodily shape, sometimes that of a man, oftener that of an animal, in order to do his work more effectively. There are many stories to illustrate this belief." Fraser went on to explain how, at Antigonish Harbor, on the northern shores of the Nova Scotian peninsula, there once lived a man who was overly fond of the bottle. One day, this man traveled on horseback to the southerly town of Antigonish, accompanied by his friend Dan. The treacherous bridle path along which they traveled passed over the North River Hill, amid whose rough tree-clad slopes, Fraser wrote, ghosts loved to wander when night closed in. Fortunately, the travelers reached their destination before such specters were astir, riding into Antigonish just before evening. There, they parted ways, promising to meet up the following afternoon so that they might accompany each other on the return journey. When Dan and his Bacchanalian companion failed to return to Antigonish Harbor by evening the following day, Dan's mother grew uneasy. Something must have happened to them, Fraser wrote. The horses might be frightened by things on North River Hill. Then there was Paddy's Hollow, where they said more than one strange sight was seen, and it was very near the burying ground besides. Fearful that the travelers might have had a run-in with one of the phantoms of the trail, Dan's mother asked her nephew, Alex, to look for them. Alex found the travelers with little difficulty, and ascertained the reason for their delay as soon as he set eyes on them. Before leaving town, Dan's companion had indulged his appetite for rum, and was now in dreadful shape, and could hardly stay on his horse. Incidentally, they had also picked up a third unwanted traveling companion along the way, a large black dog, which lurked in the darkness behind them. Although Dan and Alex tried to drive the animal away, it obstinately refused to leave them, trotting at their horse's heels like a hairy black shadow. Loath to bring the drunk man back to the home of his poor widowed mother, the travelers took him to the home of Alex's parents, making sure that the black dog remained outside as they quietly stole in through the back door. What was their horror, Fraser wrote, to see that, notwithstanding their precautions, the big black dog had passed through the closed doors. Upstairs he came, making for the room where the man lay. But in a room at the head of the stairs, Alex's two little sisters were sleeping, and the dog could not pass their door. All night that dog went up and down the stairs, and Alex knelt at the bedside of the drunken man and prayed that he might be spared, for death seemed imminent. His prayer was heard. In the morning, the dog disappeared, and the man came to his senses. His friends told him of the terrible night they had spent, and of the great danger he had run. He was so much affected thereby that he reformed completely, and died a good death some years later. Story told by the niece of Alex. He himself told it to her. Another demonic black dog is said to haunt Nova Scotia's famous Oak Island, the site of Canada's longest-running treasure hunt. Legend says that in 1795, 3 local boys found a large circular depression in a clearing in the trees on the island's eastern end. Over top of the depression, known thereafter as the Money Pit, stretched the strong arm of an oak tree, from which depended a rotting block and tackle. Having grown up on tales of Captain Kidd's legendary buried treasure, the boys began to dig, touching off a search for a mysterious treasure that has cost millions of dollars, directly claimed 6 lives, and lasted nearly 230 years. Although Oak Island's many treasure hunters have not yet, as of the penning of this piece, recovered the hoped-for motherlode said to lie beneath the surface, they have uncovered, among other things, a supposed booby trap, quantities of coconut fiber, pieces of parchment, a large flat stone inscribed with strange symbols, and fragments of human bone, carbon dated to the late 17th century, all buried deep beneath the surface. In addition to its enigmatic treasure, Oak Island is said to be a hotspot for unexplained phenomena. Throughout the centuries, treasure hunters have reported an inordinate amount of equipment malfunctions on the island, many of them involving mysterious surges of electromagnetic activity. Ghostly figures, phantom lights, and balls of fire have been seen on the island, and blood-curdling shrieks have been heard emanating from the island's triangular swamp at night. One of the island's eeriest spectral residents is a ghostly black dog with fiery eyes, which writer Darcy O'Connor referenced in his 1978 classic, The Secret Treasure of Oak Island. According to some, O'Connor wrote, this creature with blood-red eyes that glow like hot coals is nothing less than Satan's own watchdog. Others contend that it is the ghost of a ship's mascot, left behind by the original depositors. Hannah Dauphiné, who lived on the island in the early 1930s, claimed to have seen it several times lurking around Smith's Cove. Another woman, a relative of island resident Anthony Graves, was once startled by a dog as big as a colt, which disappeared into a wall of solid stone on the north side of the island. Harris Jowdry, who lived into his 90s at Martin's Point on the mainland, spent the first 10 years of his life on Oak Island. Some years ago, he told me that he saw the dog in the summer of 1900, when he was 9 years old. As Jowdry recalled it, he and a couple of his friends were walking past the money pit one evening, and there was a dog sitting at the sill of the boiler house. He watched us till we were out of sight. It was a pretty big dog, with some black and white on him, and we knew there was no such dog on the island. He was never seen before, and we never saw it again after that. We were scared, I tell you. Jowdry's description of a large dog with black and white fur, incidentally, evokes a black Belgian shepherd named Carney, which lived on the island in the 1960s. Carney belonged to the Restalls, a family of treasure hunters whose Oak Island tenure ended in disaster when Father Robert and son Bobby Jr. drowned in a water-filled shaft, apparently having been knocked unconscious by subterranean hydrogen sulfide gas. On the subject of the ghost dog of Oak Island, and Robert and Bobby Restall's somewhat mysterious deaths, it is perhaps worth mentioning the disturbing experience of Jimmy Kaiser, the daring Mi'kmaq laborer who retrieved the Restalls' bodies from the shaft. In late 1965, about 4 months after the tragedy, while dozing in the Restalls' old shack on Oak Island, Kaiser's sleep was interrupted by the sensation of suffocation. According to his son Farron, who told the story to journalist Randall Sullivan, who in turn published Farron's statement in his 2018 book, The Curse of Oak Island, Dad said it was about 11 or 12 o'clock. He said, "I had a little fire going. I put some wood on the fire, and then I lay down on the cot and closed my eyes." And apparently he fell asleep. And he said, "I woke up, and I couldn't breathe." And he said there was 2 of the biggest red eyes you would ever want to see, looking right into his. And the whole body was covered with hair, tight and curly black hair. He said that was all he could see, because the whatever it was holding him down by his arms and had him pinned so tight he couldn't move. But then it smiled at him and said, "Don't ever come back." My dad said when it let him go and disappeared, the whole building shook. According to Season 4, Episode 3 of the TV series Drilling Down, a companion to the more famous History Channel series The Curse of Oak Island, which chronicles the ongoing Oak Island treasure hunt, the following morning, Kaiser found that he was covered in bruises, one pattern resembling 4 fingers and a thumb. The island of Newfoundland, the harshest and northernmost of Canada's maritime provinces, has a few black dog legends of its own. In his 2017 book, Haunted Ground, Ghost Stories from the Rock, for example, writer Dale Jarvis refers to a black dog, which is said to haunt Coley's Point, near the ancient town of Bay Roberts on Conception Bay, on the northern finger of Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula. This canine phantom is believed to be connected with a deadly shipwreck that occurred off Coley's Point long ago, and is said to appear at the same time of day at which the tragedy took place, but only when the weather evokes the stormy conditions which drove the ship to its untimely end. In his 2010 book, Ghost Stories of Newfoundland and Labrador, writer Edward Butts included a variation of the black dog legend, set in the fishing town of St. Bride's, formerly known as Distress, located at the southwestern end of the Avalon Peninsula. In 1804, a strong young man named Thomas, who had a reputation as an excellent hunter, set out from that place to visit his father, who lived in the village of Point Lance, located a few miles to the southeast. As was his custom, he kept his musket beside him in a horse-drawn cart, loaded and primed, just in case he encountered game along the way. About halfway to Point Lance, Butts wrote, Thomas spotted a big black stag in front of him. He quickly grabbed his gun and fired. Thomas was a crack shot, but to his astonishment, the bullet had no effect on the stag. He reloaded and fired again. The animal stood unmoved. In frustration, Thomas loaded his gun with a double charge and blasted at the stag once more. He couldn't have missed, but to his amazement, the stag was unharmed. Fearing that there was something uncanny about this invincible black animal, Thomas swung back into his cart and drove to Point Lance as fast as his pony would take him. There, he described his disturbing experience to his father and some of his friends. Instead of sharing his misgivings, the older men simply laughed at him, advising him to spend more time at target practice. Thomas left Point Lance that afternoon and headed for home, his fears perhaps assuaged by his father's unconcern. Several hours later, his pony dashed up to his house, cartless, riderless, and thoroughly spooked. Alarmed, his neighbors formed a search party and set out to look for him. They found Thomas dead on the road between Distress and Lance Point, his face covered with gunpowder, which had been dumped out of his own powder horn. But there was no mark of violence on his body, Butts wrote. It was never discovered who or what had killed him. Butts then related how Thomas's wife, brother, and friend met the same mysterious fate shortly thereafter, while on their way to a baptism. Their bodies were found in the same place where Thomas had died, Butts wrote. Tracks in the dirt indicated that they had run around in a blind terror, but whatever had killed them did not leave a trace. The mystery has never been solved. The last story we will explore in this piece is not a legend of the Canadian Maritimes, but rather one of the Icelandic-Canadian oral narratives recorded by folklorist Magnus Einarsson in his 1991 book of the same name. In the mid-late 1960s, Einarsson traveled throughout the prairies west of Lake Winnipeg, in a region known as New Iceland for its large population of Icelandic Canadians, for the purpose of collecting old folktales. One of the old-timers he visited was a retired farmer and fisherman named Edward Gislason, who lived in a farmhouse near the town of Arborg, Manitoba. Gislason told Einarsson that one of his friends, many years before, had an unusual experience while working for a farmer in the Geyser settlement, between Arborg and the rural community of Riverton. He said he had stepped outside one evening, Gislason explained, and he said it had been especially bright and cloudless, and then he sees a very large dog standing there. He said he had probably been 14 feet high, and he described him for me very precisely. It was large and black and curly, a very beautiful dog, so I asked him whether he had mentioned this when he came back inside to the people. No, he said he had known there was no point in mentioning this, that they wouldn't have believed him. But at first, he said he hadn't understood this at all, but then the farmer told him that he had shot at one time an extremely large dog from out of the window, and that it was exactly in the area where he saw this dog. Conventional Western wisdom holds that the legend of the werewolf is a product of the Old World, a relic of classical mythology and medieval European superstition. From Lycaon, the ancient Arcadian king, cursed by Zeus for the crime of cooking his son, to Gilles Garnier, the 16th century hermit who confessed to hunting children in the woods of eastern France, these dark lupine shapeshifters have prowled the folktales of the old Occident for millennia. Some Canadians might be surprised to learn that werewolf stories independent of French and British influence permeate the indigenous folklore of British Columbia, the Prairie Provinces, and the Northern Territories. In this video, we will explore some of these forgotten native werewolf legends from Western and Northern Canada. At Canada's southwestern edge, across the Salish Sea from Vancouver, British Columbia, lies Vancouver Island, an enchanting land of low mountains, rocky coastlines, and Pacific rainforest. The lonely, mist-shrouded western shores of this great isle, from San Juan Harbor in the south, through historic Quebecois Sound and Friendly Cove, to Checklasset Bay in the north, are the historic kingdoms of the Nuu-chah-nulth, an ancient people more commonly known as the Nootka. For centuries, the Nootka have practiced a strange winter ritual by which certain young men are supposed to become temporarily possessed by the spirits of coastal wolves. The first written reference to this lycanthropic ceremony was made in 1803 by John Rogers Jewett, a 20-year-old English blacksmith who, along with fellow shipmate John Thompson, spent 3 years as a slave of Maquina, the chief of the Muchalat Nootka, whose incredible tale we will explore more thoroughly in a future piece. Jewett described this unusual rite in his 1815 narrative of his captivity, writing, "On the morning of the 13th of December, commenced what to us appeared to be a most singular farce. Apparently without any previous notice, Maquina discharged a pistol close to his son's ear, who immediately fell down as if killed, upon which all the women of the house set up a most lamentable cry, tearing handfuls of hair from their heads, and exclaiming that the prince was dead. At the same time, a great number of inhabitants rushed into the house armed with their daggers, muskets, etc., inquiring the cause of their outcry. These were immediately followed by 2 others dressed in wolf skins, with masks over their faces representing the head of that animal. The latter came in on their hands and feet in the manner of a beast, and taking up the prince, carried him off on their backs, retiring in the same manner as they entered. We saw nothing more of the ceremony, as McQuinna came to us, giving us a quantity of dried provisions, ordered us to quit the house and not return to the village before the expiration of 7 days, for that if we appeared within that period, he should kill us. American anthropologist Edward Sapir elaborated on this secret ritual, the particulars of which varied from band to band, in his 1911 article for the American Anthropologist. Sapir stated that the ceremony invariably took place during or preceding a winter potlatch, an extravagant feast held by First Nations throughout the Pacific Northwest, characterized by gift-giving, revelry, and the wanton sacrifice of personal property. During the first evening of the festivities, warriors dressed in wolfskins and carved cedar wolf masks emerge from the woods and encircle the gathering, howling as they scamper on all fours at the edge of the firelight. The villagers respond to this development by descending into ostensible panic, uttering fearful wails as they douse their campfires. During the chaos, several of the wolfmen dart into the milling throng and snatch a handful of preordained young men, whom they carry off into the forest. When the campfires are rekindled, the villagers become aware of the abductions and make half-hearted efforts to recover their lost kinsmen, launching fruitless search parties and setting a wolf trap. The festivities eventually resume and continue for 3 days. At night, the wolfmen make sporadic appearances at the edge of the village, howling and whistling as they dart in and out of the trees. On the 4th day, with the professed objective of retrieving the shredded clothing and scattered bones of their missing kinsmen, the villagers congregate at the edge of the forest and sing a special song. In response, the wolfmen emerge from the forest with the young men that they captured, both captors and captives being apparently mesmerized by the incantation. After hours of coaxing the wolfmen and their living prey to venture further from the forest, the villagers lasso the kidnapped youths and drive their lupine captors away. The villagers proceed to usher the howling initiates, who are all supposed to be possessed by the spirits of wolves, into a longhouse. After donning special clothing and painting their faces black, a group of older warriors who had all completed the same rite in their youth subject the demoniacs to a long exorcism, characterized by singing, dancing, drumming, and rattling. When the wolf spirits are finally evicted from their human hosts, the initiates and their exorcists undergo purification rituals involving dancing and ice bathing before rejoining their fellow tribesmen. Scots-Canadian entrepreneur and politician Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, a one-time resident of Port Alberni, Vancouver Island, elaborated on the Nootka concept of wolf possession in his 1868 book, Scenes and Studies of Savage Life. Sproat wrote that, while fasting and praying in the wilderness, in the hopes of acquiring the guardianship of a spirit protector, young Nootka warriors were sometimes said to happen upon a den of coastal wolves, who welcomed them into their pack. After a time, he wrote, body and soul change into the likenesses of these beasts. Sproat likened this supposed phenomenon to an ancient Greek legend, recounted in the 8th volume of Naturalis Historia, the 1st century encyclopedia, written by Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. Citing a Grecian author named Evanthes, Pliny described an Akkadian cult whose male members were said to have the ability to transform into wolves. These shapeshifters disappeared into the mountainous interior of the Peloponnesian Peninsula and remained there for 9 years, supposedly living among the natural members of the lupine species. Later in his book, Sproat described a savage variation of the Nootka wolf ritual, which he witnessed himself. In December 1864, while he was serving as de facto magistrate for the west coast of Vancouver Island, a wealthy Nootkan elder stabbed his female slave to death mere yards from his house, in a native village outside Port Alberni. The body was laid out without a covering by the waterside, Sproat wrote, about 150 yards from the houses. There appeared to be no inclination to bury the body, and it was only after the chief had been strongly remonstrated with that the poor victim's remains were removed after 2 days' exposure. I observed that even after this removal, certain furious rites took place over the very spot where the body had been exposed. The chief feature of this celebration, apart from the murder, was a pretended attack upon the Indian settlement by wolves, which were represented by Indians, while the rest of the population, painted, armed, and with furious shouts, defended their houses from attack. These Indians, Sproat explained in a footnote, referring to the lupine impostors, had their hair tied out from their heads so as to represent a wolf's head and snout, and the blanket was arranged to show a tail. The motion of the wolf in running was closely imitated. More extraordinary still was their acting as crows. They had a large wooden bill and blankets arranged so like wings that, in the dusk, the Indians really seemed like large crows hopping about, particularly when, after the manner of these birds, they went into the shallow water and shook their wings and dabbed with their long bills. In a plagiaristic commentary on Sproat's story, which appeared in his 1887 book, The Races of Mankind, Scottish scientist and explorer Dr. Robert Brown suggested that the Nootka wolf ritual may be allied to certain superstitions once existing among other nations, the lycanthropia of the Greeks, the loup-garou of the French, the Persian ghoul, the Teutonic werewolf, etc. Whether this had not something to do with the ideas regarding the transmigration of souls into other animals, or, as some of them say, in memory of a chief's sons who long ago were carried off by wolves, I cannot decide. A third variation of the Nootka wolf ritual is delineated by American anthropologist Alice Henson Ernst in her 1952 book, The Wolf Ritual of the Northwest Coast. In this iteration, the feast is held inside a longhouse, which the wolfmen invade at the conclusion of a particular song sung by the potlatch patron. Most members of the human wolf pack will have their faces painted black and use woven cedar bark visors to tie blankets over their heads so as to give themselves the appearances of wolves, their snouts protruding above their foreheads. The 4 leaders of the pack have the privilege of wearing carved cedar masks. As soon as the wolves come in, Ernst wrote, the fire is extinguished. Anyone can do this by throwing on a bucket of water. The people now all get up and go to different places, acting as if afraid. The wolfmen enter and crawl along the floor, circling the fireplace once, whistling. Women who have small children, 1 or 2 years old, hide these under their blankets as though afraid of the wolves. After the circuit, the wolfmen go out the same hole they came in. Someone now rebuilds the fire. 2 appointed watchmen get up and go around, looking for those who are missing. Ernst explains that the young initiates are brought by their captors to a special secluded house in the woods, where they are supposed to become possessed by wolves. One by one, she wrote, they are seized by the spirit or force, and act as though overcome. In a daze or faint, they are carried to the middle of the room and covered by blankets. After 4 days of feasting, punctuated by intermittent rituals with the ostensible purpose of rescuing the kidnapped children, the villagers coax the initiates back to civilization by singing songs intended to appease the canine spirits that have taken possession of their bodies. There follows 5 days of increasingly intense exorcism, succeeded by 3 days of ritual purification. East of Vancouver Island, across the Strait of Georgia, is British Columbia's lower mainland, the valley of the Lower Fraser River. Once covered by dense lowland forests, this coastal region is the historic domain of the Downriver Halkomelem, a collection of Central Coast Salish First Nations. According to the aforementioned Robert Brown, there is an old Halkomelem werewolf legend featuring a hunter from what is now Fort Langley, British Columbia, located across the Fraser River from Maple Ridge. Stakia, the wolves, Brown wrote, were once a tribe of Indians who were turned into their present form for their evil deeds. One day, a hunter of Kwantlen went into the mountains to seek his medicine. He traveled all that day and all the next day. Still he dreamt not of his medicine, but he resolved to find it, be a great hunter, or die. One day, he saw the light of a great fire on the side of a mountain and drew near. Round it were the wolves sitting in a circle, talking of the day's hunt. They had taken off their skins and were drying them on sticks. Our hunter sprang within the light of the fire, and instantly the wolves jumped into their skins again and howled round him. But the hunter moved not, and lay down and slept uninjured. That night, he dreamt of his medicine, and the next day he began to travel with the wolves, not his guardians, and did so for a long time, until his friends grieved for him and thought him dead. But one day, a hunter saw him in the mountains, traveling along the hillside with the wolves. Sometimes he traveled on 2 legs, more often on all 4s. His face was bearded like that of a wolf, and he looked savage and fierce. So the young man went back to his village and told the story. Brown went on to describe how the man's friends captured the werewolf with strong nets they fashioned from elk sinew and brought him back to Kwantlen. There, they discovered that their wild friend had lost all his human attributes, including the ability to speak any human language. Every night, his mournful howls were answered by his new lupine kindred, who lurked in the forest beyond the village. Eventually, the wild man slipped out of his tether and scampered into the woods. This time, the villagers did not pursue him. Legend has it that the man was spotted several times since, prowling in the mountains with the wolves. He was last spotted in the Fraser Canyon near Fort Yale, incidentally just a few miles downriver from the legendary underground den of the Dog People, which feature in an old Thompson Indian legend that we explored in a previous piece. Another West Coast werewolf legend appears in Scots-Canadian anthropologist James Tate's contribution to the 1917 book Folktales of the Salishan and Sahaptin Tribes, which appeared in Volume 9 of the Memoirs of the American Folklore Society. Remarkably, this traditional Stalo or upriver Hulkamalum story bears striking resemblance to the origin story of the Tlitscho or Dogrib Dene, a First Nation whose traditional hunting grounds lie between Great Slave Lake and the more northerly Great Bear Lake in Canada's Northwest Territories, 1,000 miles to the northeast, which we explored in a previous piece. In Tate's West Coast story, an unmarried native girl who lived at the mouth of the Fraser River in the general vicinity of Vancouver, British Columbia, was visited in the night by a mysterious young man who refused to tell her his name. Hoping to determine the stranger's identity, she painted her palms with red ochre, and when he returned to her bed the following night, inconspicuously left red handprints on his sides. The next day, the girl went throughout the village and looked for the marks she had left, but could not see them on any of the young men. When she returned home, she found her mother scrubbing the flanks of her father's dog, admonishing the fool who had painted his fur red. The girl was ashamed, Tate wrote, went in, and cried to herself. In due time, she gave birth to 11 pups, 5 male and 6 female. One of the latter was half black and half white. Infuriated by the scandal, the villagers banished the girl and her hybrid children from their company, and beat her canine paramour half to death. The wounded dog slunk away into the woods, and the girl set up her lonely camp on the Fraser Delta. That night, at low tide, the young mother lit a torch and repaired to the beach to dig up clams for her hungry pups. After a successful clam gathering excursion, the girl headed for home. Upon her approach, she heard the sound of playing children emanating from her lodge. Suddenly, as if realizing that they had been perceived, the mysterious children quit their antics, and the lodge was silent. The mother entered her house and found her pups inside, apparently fast asleep. The floor of the lodge was covered with the footprints of barefooted human children, very much unlike the tiny canine paws of her pups. The girl was puzzled that her pups had failed to bark at the intruders, considering their outward dog-like appearance, and determined to solve the mystery. The following night, Tate wrote, when she went out after clams, she put her robe on a stick, tied her torch to another one by its side, and hurried home. The pups thought she was still at the beach, and kept on dancing and singing. She crept up stealthily, jumped over the one on watch, and seized the skins of the others before they could get them, and threw them in a fire. Thus they remained children, while the black and white one remained a dog. Tate went on to explain how the pup's father returned to his family when he was healed, in the form of a good-looking man. The Dogman was a successful hunter, who fed his wife and children on deer, mountain goats, and other wild game he caught in the woods. Every once in a while, he left choice cuts of meat in the caches of those of his wife's relatives who had treated the dog mother kindly in the past. In this way, he ingratiated himself with his in-laws and eventually convinced them to accept his unconventional family back into the village. Tate's story ends on a disturbing note. Then the people all returned and were fed by the Dogman, he wrote. The 10 children of the girl grew up to be handsome men, and they married among themselves. At the eastern edge of British Columbia lie the towering snow-capped Rocky Mountains, which run along the border of that province and its eastern neighbor, Alberta. The Stoney Indians, who traditionally shared this rugged range with the southerly Kootenai and northerly Shuswap, have their own werewolf legends, 2 of which appeared in Sebastian Chumac's 1983 book, The Stonies of Alberta. Both of these stories were related by Stoney elder Joe Kootenai, or Rolling Buffalo, to folklorist Thomas T. Williams. Both of them are set on Spirit Island, a picturesque isle in Alberta's Malign Lake, named after a tragic ghost story, which we touched on in a previous piece. According to Joe Kootenai, long ago, a great battle was fought in what is now Jasper National Park between a mountain tribe and their easterly prairie-dwelling enemies. While fleeing from the advancing prairie warriors, a desperate mother belonging to the mountain tribe set her 2 small boys, named Starrobe and Scraping Wolf, adrift on a raft in Malign Lake, pushing them towards Spirit Island. Shortly thereafter, a prairie warrior bounded from the forest and crushed her skull with his war club. The invader peered out over the water, curious as to the task with which his victim had been occupied in her final moments, but was unable to see the 2 boys, as a thick shroud of mist had enveloped Spirit Island. Following the battle, the 2 orphaned boys were raised by wolves, who took them into their den and brought them meat to eat. Scraping Wolf took well to the wild lifestyle of the wolves, forging a close bond with his adopted canine brothers and developing a taste for raw meat. Starrobe, on the other hand, felt more at home by the campfire than in the wolf den, and pined for human company. When they came of age, the boys left the den and began hunting on their own, making their home on Spirit Island. One day, while they were sitting on the edge of Malign Lake making bone knives, the brothers were approached by an elderly medicine man named Braided Rawhide Necklace, who pulled himself across the water on a crude raft. As he drifted up to them, the old man withdrew 4 pale blue stones from his medicine bag, intending to give them to the brothers. Before he could do so, a wolf began to howl in the nearby woods, startling the medicine man and causing him to drop the stones into the water. Starrobe put aside his knife and dove to the bottom of the lake, retrieving the stones and returning them to the medicine man. Grateful for the restoration of these sacred items, Braided Rawhide Necklace promised to return in 4 days and repay Starrobe for his service. With that, the old man pulled back in the direction from which he had come. 4 days later, a tall woman with a blue-painted face pulled up to Spirit Island on the same raft that the old man had used. This bewitching lady approached Starrobe and introduced herself as White Hand, the eldest daughter of Braided Rawhide Necklace. At her father's request, she had come to take Starrobe back to their village, where she was to be his wife. Fascinated by this mysterious enchantress, who was the first woman he had beheld in his adult life, Starrobe readily accepted the invitation and bid farewell to his brother. Scraping Wolf is alone on the island, Kootenai said. He watches his brother disappear with a tall woman. By night, he listens to the song of the wolves. He sings to the night spirits, "I am going to make myself into a wolf." Scraping Wolf built a big fire and invited his wolf brothers to sit with him. For 4 nights, the feral hunter and his canine kinsman howled at the moon, beseeching the spirits of the lake to grant the young man his request. On the 4th night, Scraping Wolf grew wolf paws and went away with the wolves into the mountains. Later in his book, Chumac included a sequel to this story, again related by Joe Kootenai and recorded by Thomas T. Williams. It is the yellow leaf moon, Kootenai told Williams, referring to the month of September. Starrobe crosses the mountain lake to look for his brother. On Spirit Island, he finds some mysterious tracks. One footprint is human, and the other is wolf. He follows this unknown trail. Soon he comes to a large wolf lodge. Many wolves are sitting in a great circle. Kootenai went on to relate how a she-wolf approached Starrobe and informed him that Scraping Wolf had transformed into a wolf permanently. Heedless of her assurance that no power on earth could make his brother human again, Starrobe visited his brother that night in the form of an elk, assuming the appearance of that animal through the power of the blue stones he had taken from his father-in-law. Starrobe proceeded to tell Scraping Wolf the harrowing tale of his time in the camp of Braided Rawhide Necklace. Both his new wife and his father-in-law, he discovered, were what he called evil walkers and snake people, preternatural entities, perhaps related to the sinister Soyatapi, the serpentine mer-people of Blackfoot tradition. Although Starrobe's narrative is cryptic, it seems to imply that White Hand, through Starrobe's supplication, was transformed into a scattering of tiny brown pebbles by the same spirits of Malign Lake that had transformed Scraping Wolf into a wolfman. And now I come back to my brother, Starrobe concluded at the end of his speech. I will not weaken our hoop. Since there was no way to turn Scraping Wolf back into a human, Starrobe used the blue stones to give himself the appearance of a wolf. Kootenai's tale ends in tragedy, with Scraping Wolf being eaten alive by mysterious aquatic animals called dogfish, perhaps bubo or mountain whitefish, after failing to heed a warning issued by the she-wolf. The wolves blame his death on Starrobe and confront him on Spirit Island, where the surviving brother successfully defends himself. The story ends with Starrobe heading east in search of his mother's people. East of the Rocky Mountains are the Canadian prairies, a vast stretch of grassland, coulees, and river valleys, once dominated by buffalo. The western end of this geographic region, from the North Saskatchewan River near Edmonton, Alberta, to the Yellowstone River in Montana, is the historic domain of the Blackfoot Confederacy, an alliance of 4 warlike nations united by blood and a common language. One Blackfoot werewolf story appears in American anthropologist George Bird Grinnell's 1892 book, Blackfoot Lodge Tales, which the author heard from a South Piegan Blackfoot elder named Double Runner on the Two Medicine River in Montana. According to this story, there was once a Blackfoot man who had 2 shameless wives. The man suspected that his spouses had learned their immorality from other women in the band. In an effort to eliminate that bad influence, he packed his teepee onto his dog travois and moved his camp to a secluded butte overlooking a desolate expanse of prairie. Every sunset, the man sat on a buffalo skull atop the hill and gazed out over the plains, scanning the horizon for any sign of bison or enemy raiders. Weary of this lonely, self-imposed exile, the 2 wives conspired to murder their husband and return to their band. One morning, when their husband was away hunting, they climbed the butte and dug a deep pit at the spot where he sat sentry in the evenings. That accomplished, they camouflaged the hole with sticks and grass and placed the buffalo skull atop this flimsy covering. Later that afternoon, the hunter returned to camp with cuts of a buffalo that he had killed. After eating the meal that his wives prepared for him, he ascended the butte, as was his custom, and sat down on the buffalo skull. The trap door gave way, and the hunter plunged down into the pit. He was injured so badly by the fall that he could not climb his way out. Satisfied that their husband would die a slow and agonizing death, the wicked wives packed their teepee onto their travois and set out for the main camp. When they came within earshot of the camp, they began to wail, later explaining to their concerned kinsmen that their husband had failed to return from his hunting trip. Meanwhile, back at the butte, the injured hunter was found by a Great Plains wolf, who sent word of his discovery to other prairie predators. Soon, a menagerie of wolves, coyotes, foxes, and badgers were standing around the edge of the pit, gazing down at the helpless native. "In this hole," the wolf declared, "is my find. Here is a fallen-in man. Let us dig him out, and we will have him for our brother." The other canines did as proposed, and soon the hunter was liberated from his underground prison. After feeding him a raw bison kidney, the wolves dragged the cripple to their den. Here, Double Runner said, was a very old blind wolf who had powerful medicine. He cured the man and made his head and hands look like those of a wolf. The rest of his body was not changed. The wolfman lived among his canine companions for some time. One night, he led his furry rescuers to a piskin, or buffalo jump, where the Blackfoot had just slaughtered a herd of bison, many of which they had not yet processed. The natives had surrounded the carcasses with snares, set for the purpose of catching nighttime scavengers. Cognizant of these hazards, the wolfman sprang the traps, allowing the wolves to gorge themselves on the fresh meat. The wolfman and his four-legged friends repeated this thievery several nights in a row. Baffled as to how the wolves consistently evaded their traps, the Blackfoot stopped leaving their good meat out at night, prompting the wolfman to let out a blood-curdling, half-human howl, which convinced the Blackfoot that they were dealing with a werewolf. So they put pemmican and nice backfat into Piskin, Grinnell wrote, and many hid close by. After dark, the wolves came again, and when the wolfman saw the good food, he ran to it and began eating. Then the people all rushed in and caught him with ropes, and took him to a lodge. When they got inside to the light of the fire, they knew at once who it was. They said, "This is the man who was lost." "No," said the man, "I was not lost. My wives tried to kill me. They dug a deep hole, and I fell into it, and I was hurt so badly that I could not get out. But the wolves took pity on me and helped me out, or I would have died there." Furious, the Blackfoot urged the wolfman to punish his betrayers. In response, the hunter handed his wives over to the Inakatsi, members of a Blackfoot warrior society, who administered justice at the behest of the head chief. After that night, Double Runner concluded, the two women were never seen again. East of Blackfoot territory is the domain of the Plains Cree, the hereditary enemies of the Blackfoot, who have werewolf tales of their own. One such story appears in Reverend Edward Ahenaqu's 1929 article for Volume 42 of the Journal of American Folklore, in a long saga chronicling the adventures of Waheela, a legendary Cree hero and trickster figure. Near the beginning of this great Canadian epic, the child Waheela and his younger brother, following a violent domestic dispute, find themselves orphaned and alone on the bank of a river. They are approached by an evil, hairy man in a magic canoe named Wemasosu, who will later become Waheela's father-in-law. Wemasosu kidnaps the young protagonist and carries him off in his canoe, leaving Waheela's younger brother to fend for himself in the wilderness. "Brother, brother," cried the younger child from the riverbank as Waheela was borne away. "I will be a wolf." Ahenaque writes that, through his tears, Waheela saw a young gray wolf run away into the woods. After numerous tribulations and dangerous adventures, Waheela married Wemasosu's youngest daughter and settled down to raise a family. Happy though Waheela was with his young wife, Ahenaque wrote, one thing served to mar his contentment, and that was the uncertainty of his brother's fate. He lost many a night's sleep when it stormed, for the picture of his little brother, running along the bank of the river, crying after him, was stamped indelibly on his mind. He must go back and find him. One night he told his wife this, and she gave her consent to his journey. Waheela returned to the place where he had last seen his brother, and looked around for any sign as to the wolf boy's fate. He soon came across the sun-bleached skeleton of a moose, the bones being neatly arranged in a pile, evidently the remains of his brother's first kill. Waheela followed a trail of tidily stacked bone piles until he came across relatively recent paw prints. Fresher and fresher grew the tracks of the wolf, Ahenaque wrote, even as they increased in size. The brother was evidently a full-grown wolf now, and Waheela felt that any moment he might come upon him. He looked carefully around as he went, so as not to miss him. Suddenly there was a crash, and a large gray wolf bounded away from behind a willow bush. "Brother, brother, it is I. Do not be afraid of me," cried Waheela. The wolf brother stopped and approached fawningly. Ahenaque explained that the wolfman had come to fear humans, and was even ill at ease in the presence of his own brother. Waheela cleansed his sibling in a sweat lodge, and purified him with the smoke of sweetgrass, restoring him to his former human form. The elder brother then welcomed the younger man into his lodge, where he was warmly received by Waheela's hospitable wife. Ahenaque went on to relate two more stories featuring this wolf man, who was compelled to resume or cast off his lupine form according to the task he was required to perform. In the first story, the younger brother confessed to Waheela that he had a wolf wife and son still living in the woods, which intuition told him were now in danger. With Waheela's blessing, he transformed back into a wolf and set off in search of his wild family. The younger brother arrived at his old wigwam in the woods and found that it had been taken over by a family of wolverines. He found his son living with his mother-in-law in another wigwam close by, both of them in a starving condition. The old she-wolf informed him that the patriarch of the Wolverine clan had killed his wife. Rubbing salt in the wound of their bereavement, he forbade his own children from sharing any of their bountiful beaver meat with the canine couple. After subjecting the Wolverine to a humiliating defeat at the hands of his feeble mother-in-law, the young brother took up the mantle of fatherhood and taught his son how to hunt. In the second story, the younger brother accidentally chased a deer into a lake, forgetting Waheela's prophetic warning against wading into a lake or stream. He was killed and skinned by water monsters who dwelled in the depths, but was later rescued by Waheela, who retrieved his pelt and restored him to life. The werewolf legend extends north to the subarctic, to the vast boreal forest which forms the northern half of Canada's western prairies and the western third of the Northern Territories. In his 1895 book, 3 Carrier Myths, French Oblate missionary Adrien Gabriel Maurice included an old Carrier Dene story with an unmistakable connection to the Cree Waheela story above related. Maurice heard this story from a carrier woman named Lisette Elmock, who lived in the village of Stellico at the western end of Fraser Lake, about 37 miles southwest of Fort St. James, British Columbia. In this tale, the protagonist's younger brother transforms into a wolf when he is abandoned on the lakeshore by the protagonist's kidnapper, who plies the water in an iron raft. Later, after many adventures, the protagonist discovers that his wolf brother was killed and skinned by dwarves on the shores of a faraway lake. After slitting the dwarfs' throats in the night, the protagonist retrieves his younger brother's pelt and bones and brings him back to life. Another of Maurice's carrier stories, told by Zachary Nusahel of Stellico, is nearly identical to Tate's Dogman story, set on the shores of the Fraser Delta. In this legend, a maiden was visited in the night by a stranger, whom she marked on the shoulders with vermilion. The following day, she saw an old dog lurking near her father's tent, with red pigment in its fur. Soon after, the girl became pregnant, and 2 months later, she gave birth to 4 puppies, 3 male and 1 female. Scandalized, the whole village broke camp and moved away, abandoning the new mother and an old woman who thought herself too feeble to make another journey. The rest of the story unfolds similar to Tate's, with the mother picking bearberries instead of hunting for clams, and the anomalous puppy, in this story the girl, remaining a dog from the waist down, after she and her siblings were caught in their human forms by their suspicious mother. The Cascadene, who inhabit northern British Columbia and southern Yukon, tell a similar story about a girl who was impregnated by a dogman. This story is more akin to the national origin story of the Dog Ribs, lacking the subchapter in which the girl's mysterious nighttime visitor is marked by red paint. In this tale, which appears in a 1917 article by James Tate for the Journal of American Folklore, the dogman is the girl's lawful husband, whom the girl clubs to death at night when she finds him chewing on a bone in canine form. In this variation of the story, the girl gives birth to 7 puppies, 6 of them male and 1 of them female. Similar to the carrier version, the mother discovers her children's true nature on her way home from a berry-picking excursion, and the girl puppy, slipping into her dog's skin more quickly than her brothers, remains a human from the waist up and a dog from the waist down. At the end of the story, the mother and her dog children transform into stones in the Stikine River in northwestern British Columbia, in the heart of Tahltan country, southwest of Casca territory and north of Carrier country. The story's peculiar setting led Tate's informant to suspect that the Casca learned the tale from the Tahltan. The legend of the Dogman can be found further to the north, in the folklore of the Gwich'in, also known as the Kutchin or Lushu, who inhabit the frozen forests of northwestern Yukon and northeastern Alaska, and in the tales of the Gwich'in's easterly neighbors, the Hare or Satu Dene, whose historic domain is the vicinity of Great Bear Lake in Canada's Northwest Territories. According to Adrien Maurice, in his aforementioned 1895 book. These people shared a belief that they formerly dwelt very far away in the west, and beyond the sea, in the midst of a very powerful nation, among which magicians used to transform themselves into dogs or wolves during the night, while they became men again during the day. This legend, which apparently alludes to a race of dogmen in Siberia, seems to bolster the theory long held by linguists and anthropologists that the Dene nations originally came from Kamchatka, migrating across the Bering Strait land bridge into Alaska millennia ago. Maurice informs us that the legend of a race of dogmen who have heads and torsos like men and legs like dogs also appears in the writings of Abbé Émile Petitot, a French oblate missionary who lived among the Dene of northern Canada in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their name for these monsters, Maurice wrote, is Tlinakeni, which means at the same time dog feet and dog race. In a footnote, Maurice cites Petitot's 1886 French-language book, Traditions indiennes du Canada Nord-Ouest, or Indian Traditions of Northwest Canada. One story in the book, which Petitot learned from his Gwich'in informants, describes how the dogmen lived in tents, never slept, and came out at night to hunt snowy owls and large yellow mice. The Gwich'in believed that these strange creatures were originally dogs, which, through the influence of some preternatural power, had metamorphosed into their grotesque half-human forms. They maintained that their own ancestors had been the slaves of these monsters in a dark country far to the west, and that dog people could still be found in Yukon and Alaska, west of the Mackenzie Mountains. "That is why we make dogs suffer, and make them man-slaves," said one of Petitot's Gwich'in informants. "But we do not kill them. It is a crime to kill a dog, because they are our ancient enemies, and therefore human creatures. So we let them sleep in our tents, as we would men." Petitot identifies the westerly enemies of the Gwich'in, whom he believed inspired the legend of the dogmen, as a people he called the Koloches, or the Datini, perhaps the Kolchan, or Upper Kuskokwim Dene of central Alaska. Bizarrely, more than one late 19th century publication identifies the Koloches as the Haida, who inhabit the Queen Charlotte Islands south of the southern tip of the Alaskan Panhandle, 1,000 miles south of Gwich'in territory. Another identifies these mysterious people as the Chilkat Tlingit, rulers of the Alaskan Panhandle, whom an 1839 ethnography written by Russian-Alaskan governor Baron Ferdinand von Wrangel indicates may have some connection to the old Tenena legend of the Tailed Ones, or Monkey Men. If you've been following my work for any length of time, chances are you're familiar with the Nahanni Valley, a mysterious region in northwestern Canada, saturated with more strange legends and forgotten folklore than just about any other place in the Great White North. In the spring of 2018, I published a book on these stories entitled Legends of the Nahanni Valley. Later that fall, I published what would become my most popular YouTube video, entitled Interview with a Cryptid Hunter, in which I interviewed an American adventurer named Frank Graves, whose 1965 expedition to the Nahanni Valley formed the foundation upon which some of the region's most fascinating legends are based. One of the legends which Mr. Graves' expedition brought to public awareness is the story of the Waheela, a giant, strange-looking, solitary white wolf said to roam the boreal forests of northern Canada and Alaska. Suspected of being everything from a prehistoric remnant to a ghost wolf, this rare and mysterious canine has appeared in the reports of trappers, prospectors, and Indians from the mid-20th century to the present day. The following is the story of the Waheela as described in my book Legends of the Nahanni Valley, shorn of a number of subchapters, the comprehensibility of which requires more backstory than I'm prepared to include in this video. Despite these omissions, this video still contains some references to frontiersmen and biologists with which the casual viewer may be unfamiliar. Although you can absolutely understand and enjoy this video in its entirety without any knowledge of these characters, any viewers interested in putting them into context can of course do so by reading my book Legends of the Nahanni Valley, which you can find by clicking the link in the description. Without further ado, here is the story of the Waheela. Enjoy. During his trip to the Nahanni Valley in the summer of 1965, Frank Graves spent a good deal of time fraternizing with the sourdoughs of Nahanni Butte. When they finally decided that he was neither crazy nor a government agent, The locals warmed up to him and began to tell him amusing stories of unfortunate greenhorns who ventured up the South Nahanni without a lick of backcountry experience, only to come crawling back to Nahanni Butte, quote, plain scared of the world up that river. At first, wrote Graves in his first letter to Ivan Sanderson, I took the stories of the old-timers about these scared trappers and prospectors as being nothing much more than the sort of snide accounts that permanent residents of far out-of-the-way places relate about the behavior of outsiders. But this attitude of mine seems to have gotten under the skins of the locals, and the resident Amerins, and even those other Indians who wander in from the outlands from time to time. It then dawned on me that I was giving offense by not believing what they told me. So I sort of indicated that I did want to believe what they said, but that I thought they had just been pulling my leg as a greenhorn from the outside. That did it. The locals proceeded to take Graves on a tour of the lower part of the South Nahanni, showing him burned-out cabins, old rusted rifles, and other relics abandoned by woodsmen who lost their taste for this foreboding stretch of Mackenzie country. Eventually, one of Graves's new acquaintances, a local Dene hunter, agreed to take the young mechanic above Virginia Falls, where he could find unique subarctic vegetation to add to his botanical collection. As was mentioned in the previous chapter, during one such outing, Frank and his guide stumbled upon 3 16-inch-long human-like footprints in the mud of some unlucky vale, perhaps signs of the elusive Nakani. Several days later, Graves went out in the bush again with his Dene friend, who had brought his dog along with them in case they came across some game that needed flushing out. The trio worked their way up a glen, which led from the river, and onto a small plateau covered with grass and brush. Sure enough, Graves's native companion spotted some wild fowl in the timber below, and, with his dog by his side, ambled down the slope towards them, hoping to bag something for supper. Graves, who was armed with a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun loaded with birdshot, opted to stay up on the plateau in case any game appeared in that area in his partner's absence. This Indian was a pretty good tracker, wrote Graves of his Dene companion, and moved without making a sound. But his dog was not a hunter. So when I heard a noise and saw some brush moving about at the edge of the trees, I thought it was the dog coming back, and I did not raise my gun. But then an enormous white thing, that at first I thought must be a polar bear, just sort of wandered out of the trees. It wasn't a bear. It looked more like a gigantic dog. It stood straight up on rather long legs, more like a dog or a wolf. I had seen plenty of wolves, and some of them are enormous enough up there. But this thing was 20 times the size of any wolf I had ever heard of. By a sort of reflex action, I fired at it, and it was less than 20 paces away and only partly screened by little bushes. I hit it with 2 barrels of ball shot. It didn't even jump, but turned away from me and just walked back into the forest. I reloaded and fired again, and I know I hit it in the rear, but it just kept on walking. Shortly afterwards, my Indian friend bobbed up, asking what I had got. I didn't know what to say for a bit, but when I told him, we did another of our famous disappearing acts, and this time we loaded the boats and pushed off upriver, real fast. In an article entitled The Dire Wolf, published posthumously in the October 1974 issue of the magazine Pursuit, Ivan Sanderson revealed a number of interesting details about this incident which Graves did not include in his letter. Presumably in a face-to-face interview, or perhaps in another letter, Graves told Sanderson that the beast he encountered stood about 3 foot 6 inches at the shoulder, had a very wide head, and wore a coat of, quote, very long, rather shaggy white fur. Sanderson also revealed that, following the incident, Graves's Indian companion, quote, loosened up a bit and told him that they had met an animal that is not a wolf, unquote, but rather a mysterious creature which may have been responsible for the deaths of Willie and Frank McLeod, Martin Jorgensen, and other headless victims of the Nahanni Valley. The Dene said that these beasts, quote, were much larger than any wolf, were loners, avoided real wolves, had smaller ears and much wider heads, and rather short legs with splayed feet. Their tails were very thick, and more like those of otters, while they were scavengers rather than predaceous animals. Frank's companion also told him that these beasts were quite rare, and that most of them lived further to the north, in the tundra. Some of them made annual trips to the Mackenzie Mountains and the Yukon Taiga, and a few of them stayed in the Nahanni all year round. The name that Sanderson gave these cryptids, for reasons which we will explore later on in this chapter, was Waheela. Interestingly, The existence of these mysterious animals was verified in a letter written to Ivan Sanderson on July 12, 1971, by a man whose signature this author was unable to decipher. The man claimed that, in October 1970, while visiting the town of Moosonee in northern Ontario, he met an old Indian named Gugo Nanenesh, or simply Gugo, as the man refers to him later on in the letter, quote, who claimed to have come from the Nahanni area, unquote. The Dene people were terrified of these monsters, Gugo maintained, claiming that they were impossible to kill. Regarding their appearance, the Indian pointed to a huge mongrel that was running around nearby, which the writer described as, quote, husky/Alsatian crossbreed, but with the rear of a Saint Bernard, unquote, and said that the monster looked similar to that dog but much larger. When the writer inquired as to exactly how large the wild dog creature was, the Indian indicated that it had an 11-foot-long body, a 4-foot-long tail, and stood as tall as his shoulder. The rear portion of the body apparently slopes away in the manner of a bear, the writer wrote. The head appears to be low-slung and flattened, and having a broad muzzle. Colors range from brown to white. Its habits are disgusting if it exists, the letter writer continued. Part carrion eater, it can take a bear apart, but prefers to live on injured or young animals. Its delight is to snatch the young from the mother whilst she is in the process of giving birth. Also said to attack man on sight. Almost invincible, he has but one enemy. Now hang on to your hat. That enemy is... Following the publication of Sanderson's article in 1974, cryptozoologists and Fortean enthusiasts from all over North America began to speculate as to the nature of this mysterious monster, which had appeared to Frank Graves in the summer of 1965. Some thought that it might be a new species, or perhaps a survivor from the last ice age, while others suggested that it might be some sort of supernatural entity. Sanderson himself, in the aforementioned article, disclosed that one of Graves's first thoughts upon seeing the creature was that it was, quote, the granddaddy of all wolves. In other words, a freakishly large timber wolf. Considering a number of sightings reported by Nahanni frontiersmen, this sentiment is not at all unreasonable. Over the years, more than a few lupin behemoths have appeared in the Nahanni Valley. Nearly every woodsman to comment on the wolves of the Nahanni area has made some remark on the incredible size that many of them managed to attain. One of the first to put such sentiments to paper was Raymond Patterson, who, in his journal, made several references to the enormity of various wolf tracks he came across over the course of his Nahanni adventures. One of these was so large that he could fit his fist into it with room to spare, while another, measuring about 6 inches in diameter, he likened to a pony's foot. Patterson also described coming across, quote, a huge timber wolf, a great beast, looking much like the color of an Airedale through the falling snow, unquote, and noted on November 14, 1928, that his partner Gordon Matthews saw, quote, 2 timber wolves about the size of calves, unquote, down by the river. That same year, Captain Harry Doc Oakes flew Charlie McLeod and the men of the ill-fated Name expedition into Landing Lake, in Upper Flat River country. Also associated with Northern Aerial Mineral Explorations Limited were pilots R.D. Adams and W.J. Jack McDonough. On February 10, 1974, a full 8 months before the publication of Sanderson's Direwolf article, the Toronto Star ran with a story in which McDonough claimed that Charlie McLeod and his crew, during their prospecting misadventure in 1928, saw wolves that were, quote, almost as big as ponies. Another frontiersman to encounter lupine colossi in the Nahanni country was Gus Kraus, who claimed to have bagged a 155-pound wolf not far from his cabin. Kraus was one-upped by trapper Arthur George, who shot a 160-pound wolf in the Nahanni Valley in 1929. To give these measurements some context, male Mackenzie Valley wolves, the larger gender of the largest subspecies of Canis lupus, that is, gray or timber wolves in the world, have an average weight of 113 pounds. The largest wolf ever officially recorded, killed by trapper Frank Glasser on Alaska's 70-mile river in the summer of 1939, weighed 175 pounds. In The Direwolf, Ivan Sanderson mentioned that an old friend of his, a professional cameraman turned film director named Tex Ziegler, quote, made a few points about what he called the Great White Wolf of Alaska, unquote, back in the 1950s, long before Frank Graves' encounter. Before he became involved in the film industry, Ziegler worked as a prospector, then as a trader, and finally as a pilot in the Alaskan wilderness, earning himself the epithet the Flying Trader. During his days in the North Country, he came across gigantic, solitary white wolves on a number of occasions. According to Sanderson, Zegler expressed the opinion, quote, that these huge loners were just that, i.e. huge old wolves that lived alone, unquote. Similarly, in a letter to the editor published in Volume 2, Number 1 of the online Fortean magazine North American by Fortean Review, a man who identified himself as Paul W. and who worked in the outdoors industry described an enormous white wolf which his good friend encountered in the wilderness of northern Ontario, not far from his hunting lodge. He estimated that this animal, which was feasting on a moose carcass at the time, weighed at least 200 pounds. He said that it appeared to have a larger and broader than normal head, Paul stated, and that the front legs were quite long compared to the rear legs. As he put it, quote, it just looked real different than any wolf I have seen before. Much larger and more robust than even a big male should be, unquote. Paul added that he had personally seen and taken photographs of 8-inch wide wolf tracks in these same forests. Normal wolf tracks in the area, he maintained, have a diameter of around 4 or 5 inches. In addition to being extremely large, the wolves of Nahanni country also tend to be unusually aggressive. Although wolves typically avoid humans and very rarely harm them, a startling number of wolf attacks have taken place in the Nahanni Valley over the years. One of these occurred sometime in the late 1930s. The victim in this case was none other than Albert Faley. One day in late September, while out hunting moose in the woods above Virginia Falls, Albert Faley heard an unusual sound, which he described as something between a growl, a bark, and a howl. He recognized this as a call which wolves make to each other when they want to indicate potential prey. Slowly, this call was taken up by about a dozen other wolves, rising in volume until it reached a chilling, blood-curdling cacophony. Apparently, the pack was all in agreement. Suddenly, there was dead silence. Faley knew that the wolves had found their dinner and were going in for the kill. Thinking that they had caught the scent of a moose, which he might be able to intercept, he headed in the direction from which the sounds had come. After hiking for some time, Faley stopped to listen. The forest was quieter than he had expected. Instead of a frantic flurry of hoofbeats and the crackling of broken sticks, all he could hear was the distant roar of Virginia Falls. All of a sudden, a new sound arose from the woods, a chorus of soft, high-pitched whines akin to the mewing of kittens. It seemed to come from all around him. When he noticed ghostly gray shadows gliding through the willows out of the corner of his eye, Faley began to realize that he was the one the wolves had singled out for the kill. The hunter had become the hunted. The frontiersman readied his rifle and prepared for the inevitable. Sure enough, a big, grizzled alpha male emerged from the brush and came bounding towards him, loping silently through the snow. Faley felled the beast with a single shot. After firing additional pot shots at the rest of his unseen assailants, hidden as they were in the woods that surrounded him, he quickly retraced his steps to his boat and paddled downriver, denying those fleet-footed monsters of the Mackenzie their latest meal. Another Nahanni frontiersman to narrowly avoid becoming lupine lunch was Gus Kraus. In the winter of 1935, a pack of about 20 wolves chased him up a tree at the edge of McMillan Lake. Later on, in May 1942, Stan Turner, the brother of Dick Turner, was similarly chased up a birch tree by 4 slavering black timber wolves whom, he believed, had mistaken him for a caribou. And in March 1948, a trapper named Edwin Lindbergh was stalked by 4 shaggy Degahi, as the Dene called them, while setting a beaver trap not far from the Liard River. Fortunately, he managed to drive the animals away with fire and buckshot. One of the most interesting wolf attacks to occur in the Nahanni Valley, especially in the context of the Waheela, took place sometime in the early 1940s. In this story, Gus and Mary Kraus decided to head up Clausen Creek to hunt for beaver. On the creek bank, at a site located a mere 1.5 miles from their cabin, they were attacked by 2 enormous white wolves, who were apparently attracted by the scent of fresh blood. At that time, Gus Kraus was a habitual pipe smoker, and Mary hated the smell of his tobacco. Whenever the two of them set out into the wilderness together, Gus took the lead, usually with a pipe in his mouth. In order to avoid the smoke, Mary trailed far behind him, keeping a distance of up to 50 feet, often grumbling darkly about her husband's odoriferous habit as she trudged along in her moccasins. That day, when they arrived at a natural mineral lick off Clausen Creek where moose and caribou often came to taste the salt, Gus heard Mary's familiar muttering some distance behind him. Assuming that his smoking was the cause of her yammering, as he put it, he paid her no heed and carried on daydreaming. When he finally detected an edge of frantic urgency in his wife's tone, he looked up, and there on the side of the game trail, no more than 5 feet away from him, was a black bear. That's what she was yapping about, Gus explained in an interview. The bear, who appeared to be just as startled to see Gus as the trapper was to see him, snorted in surprise and started to amble away. "Shoot him," Mary urged, hoping to use the bear as dog feed. Gus refused. They were after beaver after all, and the trapper was in no mood to spend his morning butchering a bear just for dog feed. Mary, however, was adamant. After arguing with her for some time, the trapper finally acceded to his wife's wishes and fired at the animal, which was now about 25 feet away. He killed it with a single shot. The couple proceeded to skin the bear and dress its fat and meat for packing. By the time they had finished processing as much of the animal as they could carry back with them, they were covered in blood. Gus and Mary continued up Clausen Creek for about 300 yards until they reached the mouth of a small tributary. They decided to wash the blood off there, and maybe have a cup of tea when they were finished. That done, they could finally scout for some beaver. Gus placed his rifle in the grass beside him and set about making a fire at the base of a steep cutbank, which he hoped would shield his kindling from a strong south wind that had picked up. "I just set my rifle down alongside me," he said in the interview, "and set raking up a little bit of grass, to get the fire started. And all of a sudden, Mary said, 'Oh, look at the sheep.' Well, I know there's no sheep down there that low, so I put my hand down on the rifle and boy oh boy, 2 wolves, 2 white wolves, white as can be. They made big jumps, about 7 feet to a jump, one behind the other. They're just a-jumping to beat the band." It was clear that the wolves, both of which were enormous, were heading straight for them, apparently having caught the scent of the bear's blood on the wind. Gus aimed his rifle and pulled the trigger, just as the first wolf leapt over the riverbank. The animal dropped dead a mere meter from Mary's feet. "If I hadn't fired," Gus said, "they'd have had her." The second wolf wheeled around, startled by the report of the rifle. Gus fired at him and missed. The animal quickly recovered its senses and moved to bound across the creek towards Mary. "Just as he was jumping across the creek," said Gus, "I got him right through, and he dropped in the creek." Many have suggested that the monster that Frank Graves came across in 1965 was nothing more than an unusually large wolf, of which the Nahanni Valley has certainly seen its fair share. Perhaps, some say, it was a genetic freak, shunned by the pack for its gigantism. However, there are a few details in Graves' description of the creature which indicate that it may have been another animal entirely. Graves described the Waheela as having a very wide head, evoking images of grizzly and black bears, the Nahanni Valley's only ursine residents. The heads of Mackenzie Valley wolves, on the other hand, are comparatively sleek and slender. Graves' creature also had small ears, another characteristic more commonly ascribed to the ursine than the lupine. And finally, the Waheela was estimated to stand about 3 foot 6 inches at the shoulder. The average Mackenzie wolf, in comparison, has a shoulder height of between 2 foot 8 inches and 3 foot 4 inches, while black bears' shoulders typically sit somewhere between 2 feet to 3 foot 5 inches from the ground. These attributes suggest that the Waheela that Frank Graves ran into may have been an albino black bear, perhaps something similar to the starving white medicine bear which Philip Godsell encountered in northern Manitoba in the spring of 1907. Graves, however, was adamant that what he saw was neither a bear nor a wolf, but rather something which exhibited characteristics of both. Ivan Sanderson had his own theory regarding the nature of the Waheela. In The Dire Wolf, he observed that Graves' description of the animal, coupled with the descriptions given by his Dene acquaintances, who claimed to be familiar with them, corresponded with chilling accuracy to that of a mammal believed to have gone extinct several million years ago, an ancient scavenger known colloquially as the bear dog. Bears, dogs, and raccoons appear to have a common ancestry, Sanderson explained, but along the line, a group of animals that are popularly called bear dogs, the Amphicyonidae, or dogs of doubtful origin, flourished all around the northern hemisphere. These were neither dogs nor bears, but a number of them were the size of the largest living bears, and some had dog-like features. Some of these huge creatures are known to have lived on until the end of what is called the Pliocene period, and were thus contemporary with some animals that still live, like the muskox and bison, and could have well survived into the age of man, called the Pleistocene, and even into the post-glacial period on this continent. Sanderson went on to explain that the Amphicyonidae family was comprised of a number of genera, the most interesting of which, in the context of the Waheela, was the genus Amphicyon, meaning ambiguous dog-like creature, for which the broader family was named. Sanderson's particular interest in the Amphicyon genus stemmed from the fact that several of its species were known to have survived in North America, quote, until at least the end of the Pliocene period, unquote, which meant that relict populations of these creatures could potentially still exist in remote corners of the continent like the Nahanni Valley. As of 2018, there are 9 species of Amphicyon officially recognized by the scientific community, 4 of which are known to have lived in North America. Paleontologists have unearthed fossils of these creatures in Nebraska, Colorado, Oregon, California, New Mexico, and Florida, as well as in Central Asia, Europe, and North Africa. The youngest known species of North American Amphicyon, called A. ingens, was also the largest. This prehistoric monster is believed to have reached a maximum length of 2.5 meters, or 8 feet 2 inches, and a shoulder height of around 3 foot 11 inches, and to have weighed anywhere between 200 to 550 kilograms. That's 440 to 1,212 pounds. It displayed a considerable degree of sexual dimorphism, which means that male A. ingens were considerably larger than their female counterparts. This bear dog had a heavy tail, robust legs, wolf-like teeth, and jaws powerful enough to crush bone. It is believed to have been plantigrade, meaning that it walked with its foot bones flat on the ground like a bear, rather than on its toes like a dog. Due to its supposed solitary hunting and scavenging habits, it is believed to have suffered from competition with pack predators like primitive wolves, which ultimately resulted in its extinction around 6.5 million years ago. Is it possible that the Waheela that Frank Graves encountered in 1965, along with Tex Ziegler's great white wolf and the mysterious predator of northern Ontario, was a remnant Amphicyon, whose prehistoric ancestors took sanctuary in the secluded wilderness of the subarctic? Graves maintained that the beast he saw had both dog-like and bear-like features. The Ontario hunter called his own creature peculiar-looking, and all 3 men described their monsters as solitary animals, significantly larger than the average wolf. All of these attributes appear to be consistent with Sanderson's theory that these large, lonely white wolves of the North Country are bear dogs, relics of the Northland's prehistoric past. It must be mentioned that many of those who have commented upon Ivan Sanderson's Amphicyon theory have puzzled over his choice of title for the article in which he introduced it, namely, the dire wolf. The dire wolf was a Pleistocene canine, only distantly related to members of the even more ancient Amphicyon genus. Officially classified as Canis dirus, it is a larger, older cousin of the modern-day timber wolf, and is believed to have died out around 10,000 years ago. Was Sanderson suggesting, by choosing that title, that the dire wolf was another potential candidate for the identity of the Waheela, in addition to the bear dog? The answer to this question becomes clear when one considers the seemingly inappropriate title with the context of its usage throughout the piece. It seems that the father of cryptozoology employed the word direwolf as a generic term for all prehistoric canines, much as he often used abominable snowman, a once popular name for the Himalayan yeti, as a blanket term for all wild men. In his online article entitled Witchy Wolves, Medicine Wolves, and the Waheela, published on February 16, 2011, cryptozoologist Dr. Carl Schuker pointed out that the Waheela that Frank Graves encountered in 1965 bears striking resemblance to a New Mexican cryptid known to the Apache as the medicine wolf. According to cryptozoological investigator Nick Suchik, Schuker wrote, "This is a very large all-white wolf with long shaggy fur, plus a very large chest, and a somewhat long snout and body," unquote. Local Apache Indians long maintained that this creature could only be seen by certain gifted people. One truck driver, apparently endowed with such a gift, saw a creature matching the description of the medicine wolf while driving down a road outside of Dulce, New Mexico, one evening in the summer of 1979. Lit by his truck's headlights, Schuker wrote, The animal came quickly out of some brush and paused briefly in the middle of the road, before swiftly moving away and vanishing into the darkness on the other side. Another creature resembling the medicine wolf is said to have been seen by the former owners of what is known today as Skinwalker Ranch, a property located about 2 kilometers southeast of Ballard, Utah, where UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, poltergeist activity, and other unexplained phenomena have allegedly taken place for the past 50 years. The story goes that in the mid-1990s, while herding their first load of cattle into a corral located on the property, the ranch's new owners saw an enormous white wolf in a nearby pasture. The creature made its way across the field towards the family, and, to their astonishment, approached them with its head down and its tail wagging, as if it were a beloved pet. It sidled up to the children and even allowed them to pet it. Suddenly, the creature lunged at one of the calves that was pressed up against the side of the corral and locked its jaws onto its snout, apparently attempting to pull it through the bars. The family's patriarch leapt into action and proceeded to beat the animal with a stick. The beating had no effect, and the wolf continued to cling to his calf tenaciously. The rancher then seized a .357 Magnum revolver from his truck and shot the wolf at point-blank range. The animal hardly seemed to notice. Astounded, the rancher shot the wolf a second time, whereupon it released the calf and looked at him quizzically. After firing 2 more bullets into the giant canine, which elicited neither blood nor the faintest flicker of distress, the man retrieved a hunting rifle from his truck and shot the beast a 5th time, blowing a chunk of hairy flesh from its shoulder. Incredibly, the wolf remained unfazed. After taking a 6th bullet, the creature appeared to recognize that it was unwanted. Seemingly no worse for wear, the giant white wolf turned tail and trotted off into the distance, creating yet another bizarre parallel between the Nahanni Valley and the American Southwest. According to Ivan Sanderson in The Dire Wolf, the Dene of the Mackenzie Mountains maintained that giant, white, wolfish Waheela were more common in the Arctic, and that most of them only traveled south into subarctic territory once a year. Intriguingly, the Inuit have their own legends of a solitary white lupine colossus which once inhabited the Arctic, which they called the Amarok. Is it possible that the legends of the Amarok and the Waheela derive from encounters with the same type of mysterious animal? In Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo, written by Danish geologist Dr. Heinrich Johannes Rink in 1875, the Amarok is described as a fabulous wolf of enormous size, bigger than a polar bear, yet not as large as an agshik, another fabulous monster. The Amarok has more stamina than a bear, but lacks the ability to swim. It can hold an entire caribou in its jaws and still have enough room in its mouth to roar. In one traditional Inuit tale recounted in Rink's book, an Amarok took pity on an Inuit boy named Kagsagsuk and helped him attain special powers. Kagsagsuk was an orphan and a weakling, and was treated cruelly by everyone in his band. When he had taken more abuse than he could endure, quote, he ventured out among the mountains by himself, choosing solitary places, and meditating how to get strength. Once, standing between 2 high mountains, he cried out, "Lord of strength, come forth! Lord of strength, come to me!" To Kagsagsuk's surprise, an Amarok emerged. Terrified, the Inuit boy started to run for his life, but the Amarok caught him and twisted his tail around him. Using his tail, the Amarok squeezed a number of seal bones from Kagsagsuk's body. The giant wolf informed the bewildered Inuit that these bones had been stunting his growth. "If it be thy wish to become strong and vigorous," the Amarok told him, "thou mayst come every day to me." Kagsagsuk did as instructed and made daily visits to the Amarok. Every day he underwent the same procedure, allowing the Amarok to squeeze some more seal bones from his body and becoming a little stronger every day as a result. Kagsagsuk made an effort to conceal his new strength from his spiteful tribesmen, planning to shame them all once he reached his full potential. That winter, 3 polar bears were seen climbing an iceberg not far from the Inuit village. Seal hunting was out of the question at that time of year due to the frozen condition of the sea ice, and the hungry band was in sore need of fat and meat. In spite of this, none of the Inuit hunters dared to approach the 3 polar bears, members of the most powerful species in the Arctic, aside from monsters like the Amarok and the Agshik. Kagsagsuk decided to use this opportunity to reveal his newfound strength to his tormentors. Using nothing more than his mukluks and his gloved hands, he climbed the iceberg that the polar bears had ascended. When he reached the top, he wrestled with one of the bears and succeeded in slamming it so hard against the iceberg that it ripped in half. The band members, who had gathered at the foot of the iceberg to watch the spectacle unfold, gazed in astonishment as Quebecois picked up the remaining 2 polar bears one by one, hoisted them above his head, and hurled them off the iceberg to their deaths. From then on, Quebecois' fellow tribesmen treated him with deference and respect. The Nahanni Valley is said to be home to a number of mysterious creatures. So far, we have explored the Nakani, which some believe to be a type of wild man similar to the Sasquatch, the Nukluk, which Lauren Coleman proposed might be a Neanderthal, and the Waheela, which Ivan Sanderson suspected might be a bear dog. All 3 of these cryptids, in the eyes of most cryptozoologists, are anachronisms hailing from bygone eras, living fossils like the coelacanth and the horseshoe crab, defying extinction in the last hidden corners of the globe. As it turns out, these 3 are not the only prehistoric monsters said to roam the Nahanni Valley, living out their secret lives in the most wild, unexplored alcoves of the Northland. In fact, they are just the tip of the iceberg.